As the culture continues to decay, many are proposing different options that Christians might adopt in order to outlast and eventually defeat negative world. My guest, Rhett Burns, has noticed a beautiful untapped area of opportunity within the grasp of Southern Baptists. Faithful churches in need of revitalization. On this episode of Forge and Anvil, Rhett and I will discuss together how restoring these Baptist churches can help save the West. All this and more, so stick around. Welcome to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the cultural, political, and spiritual war that we are living in. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. I am a husband, a father, and a follower of Christ Jesus, doing my best to represent him well wherever I go. As I mentioned in the intro, I am joined by Rhett Burns. So, Rhett, go ahead and say hello to the audience and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Hey, Connor, thanks so much for having me on again. Yeah, my name's Rhett Burns. I am a pastor in South Carolina, in the upstate area of South Carolina, First Baptist Church Travelers Rest. We're an SBC church, formerly served overseas with the National Mission Board in Turkey, and married 4 kids. And yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Well, glad to have you on. And before we get started, for you listeners, feel free to go check out our Substack, forgeandanvil.substack.com. You can put in your email there and get all the episodes sent directly to your email when they drop on podcast formats. Of course, there's also an option to send a little tip if you feel inclined. Like and share this video. It helps boost us in the algorithms. And then follow me on Twitter at ForgeandA for additional content and updates on the show. Really appreciate it. And yes, for some of you in the audience may recognize Rhett Burns, the name you are probably familiar with, because Rhett is actually the one who is behind the original push for financial transparency within the SBC. So, Rhett, since our audience has been following that, maybe give us a little bit of context on what you were trying to accomplish with that, what the original push for the financial transparency was for those who maybe are not familiar, and then you can kind of give us an update from there on what's happened since the annual meeting.
Sure. So over the last probably 6 or 7 years, there's been a growing concern about financial transparency within the Southern Baptist Convention. And so people have made various motions over the last several years at various annual meetings, asking for, all sorts of things related to financial transparency. That's forensic audits of some of our entities, and then just other motions that have been made. And so I'm certainly not the first one to ask for something like that. But in New Orleans at the 2023 annual meeting, I made a motion asking for what we, 990 level financial transparency from our entities. And what we mean by 990, that's an IRS form that is pretty much the standard bare minimum level of financial transparency that nonprofits give. Normally they're required by the government to file this IRS form, and it's just kind of the standard bare minimum level of financial disclosure that nonprofit organizations are to give to the public and to donors, so that donors can assess and evaluate financial health of that organization. Now, of course, Southern Baptist Convention entities are not required to file that form with IRS because they're a religious, church-related organization. And the motion that I made would not require them to file it with IRS. Rather, what we asked for was for our entities to give that same level of information and financial disclosure, not to the government, but to Southern Baptist churches and messengers. And so what that is, what the 990 has on it, so it has just kind of broad level, bare minimum financial information. So it has your program level financials, which some of those are already disclosed in the annual reports and things like that. But what it also has, it has executive compensation, which that's an important piece of financial information for churches and messengers to know, because it allows the churches to evaluate trustee boards. And so messengers appoint the trustees to the various entities, and executive compensation is just one of those just kind of standard financial, kind of good governance protocols in order to evaluate trustee board. So it's not a morbid interest in anybody's salary. It's certainly not to disparage anyone from making a large salary. I believe that those who are leading large organizations, a worker is worthy of his wages, and it makes sense to me that they make large salaries. But I believe when you're making those salaries on the generosity of Southern Baptists, on the tithe dollars of Southern Baptists, it only makes sense to have some financial accountability there to the messengers and to the churches. So executive compensation is a big piece of that. Also, the 990 has information related to conflicts of interest with so it has you disclose transactions with trustees, or what the 990 calls other interested persons. It has information as well on your top contractors, and so that Southern Baptist churches can know at a fairly broad level and a fairly, what I would say, a bare minimum level, but how are their missions dollars being used by our entities. And so there's been a number, we can talk about this some if you'd like, but there's been a number of instances just over the years where there's been financial mismanagement and at various entities. And so this is, it's not the silver bullet that's going to solve all of our financial problems, but it is a good way to start to get financial accountability, transparency from our entities. And so made that motion in New Orleans. And then after that, it was taken up. It was referred to the executive committee, as many motions that are made at the annual meeting are. And so the executive committee took it, that specifically their committee on finances and convention stewardship, I believe it's called. And so they took it and allowed me to come speak to that committee at the February meeting. They did not make any decision at the February meeting when they discussed, but rather put that on the agenda for their June meeting, which was held the day before the annual meeting. And at that meeting, what they decided, actually, I think they decided ahead of time over some Zoom meetings that were not public. But then what they just made their decision public at the June meeting of the executive committee, which that decision was, we are not going to bring it out to messengers for a vote, what we were really hoping for. I believe this is a decision for messengers to make. Unfortunately, that motion died at the finance subcommittee of the executive committee. And instead, what they said they were going to do was work with the entities and try to come up with a plan to increase financial transparency, and then report back to the convention in Dallas. Having already had a year to do this, I was not exactly pleased with that, obviously. Wanted the messengers to have a chance to vote on it. So what I did in Indianapolis at the annual meeting was made a very similar motion, and so tweaked a little bit of the language to specifically include the executive committee, so that they would be reporting the same level of information. And then also there were some concerns, the International Mission Board and others, about our international missionaries, that some of this financial disclosure could put our international missionaries at risk. I've served with the IMB. I'm very aware and sensitive to those concerns, having served in a predominantly Muslim country where there were very real security concerns. And so we tweaked some of the language in order to account for missionary safety. Now, I believe that the original motion would not have put any missionaries at risk, contrary to what Paul Chipwood told his trustees about it. But in the interest of going above and beyond to make sure, we don't want any of our missionaries, mission partners overseas to be at risk. And so we made some adjustments in language, made the motion again in Indianapolis. It was again referred to the executive committee, tried to get that brought out for discussion at the annual meeting. Unfortunately, though we only needed a simple majority in order to make that happen, probably only got about 25-30% of the room to vote to actually discuss it. And so it is again in the hands of the finance committee at the EC. That's kind of where we stand right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and unfortunately, it's one of those things that I think talking about finances and financial transparency and 990 forms, it's really wonky insider baseball that I think the average layperson who's maybe showing up to the convention doesn't know enough about to care very strongly either direction. I think the hope is that some of our messaging that those of us who are pro financial transparency, kind of we laid a foundation that hopefully will allow us for some positive traction in that direction in some of the future annual meetings that we have coming up, because we need it. A prime example for you listeners who weren't already aware, and I know Rhett, you're probably very familiar with this, but at the annual convention there was a race car all decked out in Southern Baptist decals. And anyways, immediately as people started showing up, so many people were asking questions like, how much did this cost us? How much of our tithe money went to having a race car? And I don't know 100% what the full story is. Maybe you do, but I understood that it was essentially donated, so it didn't actually matter. But what I was telling some friends as we were discussing Rhett's financial transparency push is, I wouldn't even question if I had the financial transparency, because even though what Rhett was asking for would not have necessarily disclosed the amount that was spent on this race car, if any was spent at all, it would at least tell me the largest expenses that the SBC had throughout the duration of that period of financial disclosure. And so I can know that, okay, it's for sure not going to be in the top 5, because we can see what the top 5 are. But right now, we don't know what the top 5 expenditures are. We don't know what the top 5 salaries are. We don't know what all these executive compensations are. So we can only speculate, which unfortunately, because it seems as though the average layperson in the SBC is not being trusted by leadership to know these details, we can only assume the worst when we see things like a race car decked out in SBC attire. We then immediately jump to, oh, this is probably negligent spending. Feel free to add any thoughts to that, Rhett.
Yeah, I think what that shows is the very crux of the matter is there's a real lack of trust with the SBC right now. And so for the last year plus, when I've talked about financial transparency in the SBC, I've tried to make the point that our mission cooperation, our Great Commission cooperation, runs on trust. And right now we're running at a deficit of trust. And so if we had a culture of financial accountability and transparency, then when you saw the race car, the assumption might be that, oh, that was probably donated. That was, there wouldn't be assumed various motives. But when everything is kept under wraps the way it is now, the first question is, where did that money come from? How much was it? Was this poor spending and things of that? Because there is really a lack of trust. And so it really is one of those issues that I think it's growing in support. I think in the room at the annual meeting, it's one of those kind of wonky issues, and people really didn't know, what this was about necessarily, because we didn't get to discuss it. I think if we had a chance to discuss it, it would have had much more support. But it is something that it's an issue that's not going away. It's an issue that's gaining steam. It is an issue. It's a matter of messenger education. Let people know what this is. What are the, you get the report to entities, and it's a 15-minute infomercial about all the great things the entities are doing, and praise God for those great things that they are doing. But people don't hear about some of the other things that are going on, and some of the questionable financial practices, or the things that undermine trust. But on the subject of how popular an idea is, it is an issue that covers a broad stream of Southern Baptists, and so it has support from various. I hate to use the word, coalitions or factions or wings of the convention, but for lack of a better way of speaking about that, from various wings of the SBC, you have support from this. And so there are people that I have, some pretty sharp disagreements about in other areas of Southern Baptist life, but we agree that, hey, Southern Baptists ought to know how our money is being spent. And so because of that, it's not an issue that's going to go away. We're going to have to deal with it at some point. I think they'll try to deal with it in some way over the course of the next year. I think some of that effort at DC will be in good faith. I don't know that all of it will, but But what I'm afraid of is that it's not going to meet that bare minimum standard of the 990, and it's not going to have some of those major pieces of conflicts of interest, executive compensation, contractors, things of that nature. But rather, I'm afraid what they're going to do is just try to make the information that's already available, and there is some. I don't deny that some financial reporting already happening. It's obviously there. If you dig into the annual report and the ministry reports, I think what they're going to try to do is take that information and make it more easily accessible. And that's a really good idea. I think that information should be, more user friendly for the average Southern Baptist. However, it's just not sufficient. It's not sufficient for accountability to the churches.
Right. It's like any movement towards financial transparency, we'll take it as a win, but it's not the end of the fight for financial transparency. We need a little bit more trust so that we can actually operate in good faith when we see race cars, or when we see anything. I mean, I know that there's a lot of amazing things that the Southern Baptist Convention is a part of. So ultimately it's just a matter of like, trust us so that we can just see the numbers and know that you guys are being responsible as leaders, because I know there are amazing things going on. I know that NAM was gifting couples with money for adoptions. So a lot of great things happened at this annual convention. So we don't want to minimize any of that. It's just ultimately, if we can get financial transparency, I think we're all going to be in a lot better shape. And really, we're just talking about reforming things that that just need reforming, so that we can make an entity that we both believe in that much better. And that's kind of the broader topic that I was having on the podcast for us to talk about: revitalization within the Southern Baptist Convention. You, of course, wrote an article a while back now on American Reformer titled "Restore Baptist Churches to Save the West." So I guess we'll just start by asking you what kind of your vision is when you think about restoring Baptist churches to save the West.
Sure. So uh, that article came about. Timon Klein and Clifford Humphrey over at American Reformer had published an article about cultural insurgency, and just kind of having an insurgent mindset when it comes to national revitalization in our country, and thinking locally, thinking smaller, thinking about networks of anti-fragile institutions. And they phrased that initial essay as kind of an initial volley where they wanted to have some feedback and some discussion about that. And so as I was reading their essay, I was trying to think concretely, okay, where does this come down? Where does this come down practically? Where does this come down practically in, in my context? And so I think one specific application of what they're arguing for in adopting a cultural insurgency mindset for national revitalization, one specific application of that is to revitalize Baptist churches. And so some of what they were talking about in the article, they were adopting some concepts, I believe, from Aaron Renn about own space and about capturing loyalties. And so I tried to frame my article within the framework of theirs. And so I believe there's a really big opportunity for church revitalization among Baptist churches, specifically in Appalachia in the South. Certainly not limited to that. Certainly don't want to ignore gospel work, church planting, church revitalization in cities as well. But there's a huge opportunity where you have a lot of churches that were healthy at one point in time that are declining, and they have own space. They have their own facilities, they have their sanctuaries, they have their fellowship halls, they have their gyms, and they have their education buildings, and they have that own space that really could be redeployed in partnership maybe with some other institutions. There's currently you have maybe you have a new church plant, you have a new Christian school, and you're renting space from somewhere. But if you don't toe the line of kind of the cultural zeitgeist, you run the risk of your lease being terminated and being kicked out. Well, these churches, they have these spaces. They can partner with these other institutions and form these networks of anti-fragile institutions. And so there's that concept of own space. They also talked about capturing loyalties. And so the idea being that, you identify a group of people that is, that that your enemies need to have their loyalty in order to advance their agenda, and you capture their loyalties instead. And what Klein and Humphrey said in that article, that, you know, for our ends, that means the normies, those who are probably naturally aligned, maybe don't quite know what time it is, and there's an opportunity specifically with Baptist churches, just because America religiously is very much Baptist, just because of the proliferation of Baptist churches back in the 18th and 19th century. And so you have a lot of people with cultural memory of Baptist churches. Maybe they grew up going to VBS, playing church basketball. They have this already something of a relationship with Baptist churches in their past or in their family history. And so it's not a stretch to you know, outreach to reach out, to those people. And if you can revitalize those churches and capture the loyalty of those people through bold preaching and through rich pastoral care for them and their families, particularly in the hard times in which we live, then there's an opportunity to capture their loyalty. And now they're not useful for the other side's ends. And so that's within the framework of the article, kind of where I was going, and just realizing that there's the opportunity is there, the means are there, and we can get into some of that. But the question is, do we have the will to do it? And to not only look to the cities, and not only look to domestic mission work out west, but also to think back to where, specifically thinking about the Southern Baptist Convention, to our roots in the South and Appalachia, and seeing a lot of struggling churches that need revitalization. And so that's the work that I'm in, not in a extreme rural context by any means. In the upstate of South Carolina, formerly rural area, small town church that was in need of revitalization. Been there 2 years. Lord's been kind to us, and that's what I'm giving my life to, is revitalizing and revitalizing this church, and preaching the word, teaching, giving pastoral care, and from there, want to see revitalization and a resurgence of biblical, strong Christianity here in our community.
That's amazing. I wanted to pull up this map here. So this is percentage of population absolutely certain that God exists. So I wanted to show you this to kind of show the importance of the SBC. You can see here that it's got the United States, and it's also got Europe. And yellow is only 10 to 29% of the population certain that God exists. The tan color is 30 to 49%. The purple is 50 to 69%, and the blue is 70 to 82%. So for those who are just listening to the podcast only version, you'll see on this map that most of the U.S. is purple. So according to this survey, at least, most of the U.S., at least 50% of the population believes they are absolutely certain that God exists. So that is a wonderful thing. We're very happy about that. You can see kind of in New England, those numbers are lower. It's in the 30 to 49%. But in the South, states like Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Missouri, Oklahoma, and others, there is a dark blue 70 to 82% of the population that is absolutely certain that God exists. Now, if we go over to this other map that I've also got pulled up, again, for those listening on podcast, this is a map showing the location of Southern Baptist churches in the United States, according to the 2010 U.S. Religious Congregations and Membership Study. And you'll see all the red dots represent Southern Baptist churches. And you can see that the South is completely covered. It is almost an entire red blackout of these red dots that represent these churches in the SBC. So in the area where we see Americans still believe at a 70% or higher percentage that God absolutely exists, is all in the areas that are directly overlapping with the SBC church location map. that we see here. So obviously, we're not going to pretend that the SBC is the only thing that we can credit to this high belief in God's existence. But I think it'd be foolish to also pretend that the SBC does not play most likely a large role in that very fact, because you can see in states like the West Coast where there's sparse SBC activity, there's also a smaller population that is absolutely certain that God exists. And so to Rhett's point in both the article and what he's already laid out for us here on this episode, there is some rich soil that is ready for these individuals, because 70% might believe that God exists, but 70%, unfortunately, I don't think 70% are regenerate believing Christians, especially church attending Christians. But there's a sort of cultural Christianity that is producing this ripe soil that is ready for churches to be revitalized and for a muscular Christianity to go in and actually seek out these people and present them with the gospel, and they're primed and ready for it. So if we're going to see any form of revival in America, I believe that it's going to start in the American South. Your thoughts, Rhett?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways you might look at that map. Somebody might look at that map and say, see, this is why we need to concentrate on the West Coast, up in, we need to concentrate up in New England, because that people aren't believing, and there's an amount of truth there. But there's also the sense where we need to run where we're strong, and we have the infrastructure there with these churches that are declining or dying, where there's still maybe a faithful remnant of believers in that churches, and they have their facilities, and they have what you said there, which is super important. You have the rich soil of people who have at least a belief that God exists, even if they're not true regenerate, believing Christians yet. And so, I mean, the stats where I live, 8 out of every 10 people within a 5-mile radius of my church are not believers. They're not connected to Christ and His church, and yet, those statistics, I think, would bear out that 70% or more of them believe that God exists. And so what you have there is rich soul ready to hear the gospel and to believe and to follow Christ. And so I think you're exactly right. That's where we need to focus, not to the exclusion of other places in the country, not to the exclusion of other places in the world. But I do think that we don't need to ignore our roots, and we don't need to ignore where there seems to be the rich soil that's ready for harvest there. And so, and just running where we're strong, where we have a number of faithful churches, and then also many other churches that just need faithful, godly, and bold leadership. There's a leadership crisis in the church right now. There's a pastoral shortage right now, and so we need to raise up men who can pastor and love these churches. One criticism of the American Reformer article was, that some people saw it as more of a pragmatic argument of you're trying to use the churches just for a political project, and that's not that at all. I certainly wouldn't argue that the primary reason we ought to revitalize Baptist churches is to save the West necessarily. The primary reason we need to revitalize Baptist churches is because we love the church, and we love God, and we love His church. We love Jesus, and we love His bride, and it's for God's glory. It's for the good of those people who need shepherds, and it's for the good of those communities that need a strong and faithful gospel witness. That's primary. This article is in the context of a larger discussion about national revitalization. So that's why that I focused on it there. But that's certainly not the only reason. But those things integrated because Jesus told us to disciple the nations, including our own. And so that's the reason I believe we need to focus on these churches, particularly in the American South, where we have a strong opportunity, where we can run where we're strong.
Yeah, I agree. And I think something that I've been talking about in a lot of my conversations, both on the show and just in my personal life, is the fact that I really think that American Christians we spread ourselves too thin. I think we really have a beautiful heart for seeing people brought to Christ, but we focus so much on sending missionaries overseas, and there's nothing wrong with that, of course. And I don't want any listener to misunderstand me. But I think that we've been so focused on trying to Christianize Africa and China and all these other places that our own country is no longer Christianized. And so what we're really talking about is we're talking about a tactical, I don't want to call it a retreat, but really just a regrouping and seeing, okay, where are we strong? Well, we can see that the Christianity is still strongest in the South. So maybe we should sort of, find ourselves and regroup, find new strength so that we can then expand that circle, by going just one circle farther out from the nucleus at a time. Instead, I think that we try to spread ourselves so thin that we think that we can win by making sure that our troops are out on the battlefield, the spiritual battlefield, completely outnumbered everywhere they go. And sometimes that's just not how you win a war. And the Bible is very clear that this is a spiritual war that we are living in. And so we need to think tactically like soldiers. And then to your point about the West, I believe that we should want to save the West, not because, to your point, that we have our hope in the political realm, but what made the West so great? I think any honest historian that actually truly evaluated the last several hundred years and more of human history can say that the West was made great due to Christianity. Christianity brought about scholarship and brought about hospitals and orphanages and so many of these things that ended up becoming institutions that made the West a absolute dominant force in the world on the global stage. And I think that it would be honoring it would be dishonoring our forefathers to just let it go by the wayside so easily. That doesn't mean that we don't care about these other countries. Of course, we do, but we also have to recognize that if we don't have the resources to tackle every single battlefield, let's try to win a few battles before we try to just lose every battle. And that's really what I'm advocating here. Let's have a tactical regrouping so we can start getting some points on the board and then go from there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We don't want to squander our inheritance in the West. Our forefathers built something great by God's grace and for God's glory, and so we don't want to squander that inheritance. So we need to be careful and make give the effort to preserving that. But I think framing it in this way is helpful in some ways because there's a tendency, or at least there has been. I know when I'm coming through college and right after college, where there's this huge push to go to the cities. There's this huge push to go to the nations and go overseas, where there's a little bit of feeling guilty if you don't. Because if you are a real strong Christian, if you are a real ambitious Christian, if you really wanted to live for God, or you would give it all up and go to one of these places, and praise God, there, people do that, and they go out and they win glory for King Jesus in hard places. But framing this discussion about church revitalization, where somebody's going to go to a small town, somebody's going to go to a rural area, somebody's going to go. It's not an exotic place overseas, and it's not a major, cultural power center here in America. But helping them see that they're doing really strategic, really important work by loving these Christians in this specific place and giving your life to revitalizing this church, this particular church. I think that helps because you have men who are ambitious. They will do something great for the Lord. They've heard William Carey's quote about expect great things from God and attempt great things for God. They want to attempt great things for God. And I think helping them see that revitalizing a church somewhere in the South, somewhere in Appalachia, so anywhere, but giving your life for God's people, and giving your life to serve God's people as you serve Christ, that really is important. That really is strategic. That fits in Christ's plan for the Great Commission to disciple the nations and baptize them and teach them to obey all that Christ commanded. I think we need to speak in these ways to capture the imaginations of young men and deploy them to do this really important work. Because if otherwise, if only international missions, and I've done that, it was great. We loved our work overseas. Lord did some incredible things there in us, and got to see what He was doing there among unreached and unengaged peoples. That was fantastic. But if that's the only thing that an ambitious young man, and I don't mean ambitious in a worldly way, but ambitious in that you just want to do something important with your life. You don't want to waste your life, right? If that's the only way, then the American South falls by the wayside. And then what we've talked about it in its strategic importance, well, that falls by the wayside too. And so I think framing these things in this way is really important.
Yeah. I completely agree, and we need to sort of rescue that ambitious mindset. I think for myself, when I've thought about assuming leadership roles within the church, I always tended to gravitate towards the verses that just give a clear warning that not all of you should be teachers, not all of you should be leaders, because you're going to be held to a higher standard, and that's true, and you should take those verses very, very seriously. But simultaneously, the scriptures say that it's a good thing to desire that. And I think that the American church also forgets that as well. Because to your point, it seems as though the only real occupation that is praiseworthy was sort of overseas mission. At least that's how it was for me in a lot of my circles growing up. And of course, pastoral ministry was highly praised as well. But I think there was a greater emphasis on making sure that you are truly called to pastoral ministry, because of the high calling that leaders have, which is of course true. But simultaneously, there are so many men that had these ambitions that were told that they needed to use that ambition by going overseas and trying to completely start up a church from scratch in a pagan culture, or doing that in the middle of downtown Portland where church plants go to die. Whereas some of these men probably should have just been, metaphorically handed the keys to the church a couple blocks down the road, in rural Mississippi, or in the suburbs of Missouri, and these men may have found real success there. But instead, it seems as though we culturally, as Christians, we have so prioritized the cities to a point that we sort of set young men who are passionate for ministry up for failure. I had a conversation, it's been a while now, with Joshua Hames, and he's a church planter his church plant died because of they were all trying to church plant. I believe it was in LA or somewhere, very hostile towards the Christian faith. And they had a bunch of young families who realized that they couldn't afford anything. They couldn't actually start having children. And they realized that they needed to regroup. And he has, and now he's in the South. And so it's just unfortunate to see that is a trend. But I think it's a trend that we need to continue to highlight so that hopefully we can see that trend go down. And again, it's not because we don't care about the cities, but it's because an overemphasis on one over the other has led to a decline in these churches that you've already mentioned have owned space and are ripe for revitalization. So with our remaining time here, Rhett, I wanted to kind of ask you what you think are sort of the big needs when it comes to revitalizing Southern Baptist churches, whether it be in the South or otherwise.
Sure. So I think several things. The first big need is we just need faithful pastors. We need faithful pastors who will go to these churches and stay at these churches, and love the people in those churches. And so that would be the first thing I think we need is just these churches need healthy, godly leadership. And I think those churches need bold preaching. They need pastors who are very aware of the times in which we live, who are aware of the cultural pressures that their church members face, and are willing to apply all of the Bible to all of life and address some controversial subjects, address those in uh, in wise pastoral ways, not just looking for controversy, but not shying away from it either. And I think really in some ways, you have these church members and they're working, regular jobs and they're facing all sorts of pressures there. They need to know that their pastor's on their side. Their pastor's not chiding them. Their pastor's not compromising with the spirit of the age in any way. They need to know that the pastor's on their side. And I think particularly in places like the American South, you have this ripe soil of those who believe in the existence of God generally, and those who are what I would call on the unbelieving right. But their view of what they've seen of the church often is a very weak and neutered experience of church and the faith. And so I think if you have bold preaching and cultural leadership from pastors of those churches, that then trains those church members to live with that same boldness and that same confidence in God's word and same confidence in the lordship and kingship of Jesus, then you can really see some advance of the gospel and the kingdom in those communities. So you need leadership, you need bold preaching, and I'd say those churches need strong pastoral care. These aren't ministries where anybody's going to go to make a name for themselves. These are ministries where men are going to go to die to themselves, and hopefully stay long enough to die in that community. And while they're there, they're going to love those people, and they're going to care for those people. And I think that's what people need. They need somebody who's going to sit in front of them with an open Bible and pray with them and give them direction from that Bible and care for their souls and give them direction for their lives. And those are the things that I think are foundational. The other stuff that goes on with church and programming and all of those things, it's going to vary by context of what needs to be done. But godliness, leadership, and pastoral care, and just an awareness of the times in which we live, and being willing to speak to those and take a stand on those are the things that we need right now.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that those of us who already have our minds on these things need to continue to just pray that that God will raise up, a generation of men that are willing to step into the pulpit and step into these leadership roles. And of course, not every listener that we're talking to, needs to be called into ministry. We don't want to bind your conscience into thinking that that's what we think you should do. More or less, it's just recognizing how you can help with these type of projects.
On that, sorry to interrupt. On that, can I say one thing there?
Sure.
I'd say that's another thing that churches need. They need faithful church members. And
Yes.
So particularly, maybe you've moved into an area, and so you're in a position where you're trying to find a church home. I'm not encouraging anybody just to leave their churches and go look for somewhere, though maybe that's the case. Maybe it'd be great. You could really be a blessing to a church that's revitalizing just by being there. Particularly, you're a young family, you have kids. I was talking with a guy not too long ago, and moved to an area, was looking for a church. But one concern about this particular church was, hey, there's no other kids around. And what I told him was, somebody's got to be the first. Somebody's got to be the first family with kids that sticks around. That was the case at our church when we went. My one big concern about going was our kids were going to be the only kids at the church when we first went. Praise God, He's brought other families, and we have kids there now. But somebody has to be the first one. So there's another family that came with us from our previous church that our church. That church had sent out with their blessing to come with us, and praise God for that, because somebody's got to be the first to stick around. Those churches need mature members, those who love Christ, who love the Bible, those who are willing to serve, those who are willing to be faithful in their membership duties and their attendance. And so I would encourage you don't have to be a pastor to be a part of church revitalization. Find a church in your area that is revitalizing. Maybe they just called a new pastor. Maybe in partnership with a local association or state convention, they're actually doing an official kind of church revitalization with some resources being poured in and some help from some other churches. But you can go there and be a huge blessing to that church just by going and being a faithful church member there. You will bless that pastor. You will bless that church. There will be old people there who are just delighted that your 4-year-old is there in service with them. And so that's just another, I think, need. We don't need to only talk about the leadership aspect, but the membership aspect of revitalizing churches is so important. And so I would encourage listeners, if you're in a situation where you're going to be transitioning to a new church because you've moved or whatever the reason is, or maybe you just go to your church leadership and say, there's a church down the road, they're trying to revitalize. Would you send me out to just go be a faithful church member there with your blessing? That type of partnership between churches in an area is a wonderful witness to the gospel and is a huge help to the revitalizing church.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I think more people need to be thinking about that. I think oftentimes we think about what kind of programs our church has available for us. We think about, are there enough people my age there to make friends with? Are there enough people there for my children to make friends with? And obviously, it's important to have community and fellowship, but we also need to think about what we can do to serve the church. And some of us may be called to be the first, as you pointed out. So I really think that's very helpful to our listeners. So that said, Rhett, I know there's probably so much more that we could talk about on this topic. Maybe we'll do a part 2 sometime. But where can people go to keep up with you and everything that you have going on?
You can find me on X at Rhett_Burns. Occasionally write for the Center for Baptist Leadership, and so you can find some articles, especially on the SBC Financial Transparency. You have a few articles up there on that subject, but find me on X at Rhett_Burns.
Awesome. Well, thank you, listeners. We appreciate you joining us. Feel free to go to forgeandanvil.substack.com. That is home to our podcast. You can find all the episodes there, as well as some additional writings from yours truly. Really appreciate you listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, Connor.